So we welcome Joe Cunningham, and we're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, thank you. Not only is my great friend Ken Hannon, one of the head honchos here. He has some fancy title, I don't know. And it's so great to stay with him and his wife Chris. I'm going to have help hold quilts tonight. But also my great Facebook friend Anthony Jones is here. It's one of the coolest things about Facebook and traveling around the country is I meet these people find out what they actually look like. That's what's fun. Ken and Chris took me around today to give me a tour of the area. We went out over some. There's a lot of bridges, and we went over several of them out to Sand Key, and I had lunch at Columbia, which I recommend highly. I told you we need more chairs. There's just barely enough room. It's so much fun. It's sort of like having a glass of wine in church here. Wine in the art gallery. It's so cool. I wish I could have one. I'm going to have one later. A little town called Warden, way up in the north of England, just a couple miles from Scotland. A boy was born named Joe. Joe Headley was his name, who grew up to be a tailor. And at some point in his life, he stopped being a tailor and took up quilt making, and he was known for the rest of his life as Joe the Quilter. And 200 years after that, more or less, in Flint, Michigan, another Joe was born, who grew up to be a rock and roll guitar player, who at some point in his life, for some reason, took up quilt making and got to be called Joe the Quilter. And what actually happened was that when I first found out about quilts, I wanted to read all the available literature. And in one of the books, a book about English quilts, there was the story of this guy named Joe the Quilter. And I was just starting to make quilts, and I was very impressionable. And in my 20s, and here was this story about a guy named Joe who was a professional quilt maker. And I loved this idea so much that about 2 months later, I went out and had business cards printed up that said, Joe Cunningham, professional quilt maker. Which is my gift to you. That's all it takes. Nobody can prove you're not. And over the years, whenever a book about whenever a book about British quilts came out, they would always have the story of Joe the Quilter. There's a page or 2 pages telling the story of Joe the Quilter, and little bits about his life, and I always read these stories. And one time, a book came out about British quilts around the year 2000, and it had the lyrics to the Ballad of Joe the Quilter. Now, I'm a guitar player. I don't need the music. I can write an English ballad, and here's the lyrics, and I had this whole idea because I've been a guitar player my whole life, and played for a living for a long time before I took up quilt making. And I still play, and I go out on gigs, and I have a lot of musician friends and so on. And then I have my other life where I make my living in quilts, and you know. So it's these two parts of my life, like they're two circles, and you would be amazed how little overlap there is. Two circles. The guys on the gig never want to know anything about how I make my living. The subject never comes up, you know. It's just, a guy did ask me one time, he says, "Oh, hey Joe, how you doing down there at the knitting contest?" So I had this idea that I could take my guitar on the quilt gig, and I could play music, and I could play the Ballad of Joe the Quilter. You know, wouldn't that be great? And I read the lyrics with this in mind, what kind of music would they require, and I hated them. They were all about how poor old Joe died, which is something I don't want to know, quite frankly. How poor old Joe died. Verse after verse about poor old Joe. Yeah, come on. You know, presumably he had a long and interesting life. A quilter named Joe. And, it just bummed me out, you know, how poor old Joe died. Ballad. I could write a better ballad. So one day I sat down and wrote the Ballad of Joe the Quilter, my own Ballad of Joe the Quilter. And I played it for a friend of mine who then said, well, that's good. Now what happens next? So I had to write the next song to figure out what happens next. And what happens next? And the next thing you know, I was writing this thing that was this musical version of this guy's life story. And then it reached a point where he started making quilts. And so I had to make the quilts to illustrate the story. And so I worked on it for a couple of years on this whole thing. There was days when I would wake up and I didn't know if I was Joe the Quilter or Joe the Quilter. There were spots in the story where the facts were missing, so I would have to make them up. My daddy hauled coal in the winter. It didn't take me too long to see. The hauling coal in the winter, that was not the life for me. Filling and emptying pail after pail, shivering and cold in my seat, watching the horses swishing their tails and wishing for something to eat. While wiping my nose on my sleeve, filling coal bins was not in my dreams. Apprenticed to old Mr. Miller, learning my toiles and brocades, keeping my eyes wide open to each tiny stitch that he made. Learning the art of the waistcoat, who to make fat and who to slim. Learning to make conversation with a mouthful of straight pins. Sewing just the hidden seams. I made it all fit in my dreams. At 21, I earned my freedom. I set up shop in my hometown. Spent most of 1 year making rich clothes to wear around. Gentlemen gawked at my waistcoats, my shirts with lace collars and cuffs. Businessmen ordered my waistcoats, breeches just fancy enough that they could pretend they sold wares to the Queen. And I made it all fit like a dream. For my second-hand silver, tasted like tea from the new. Nobody noticed the chips on my bowls when I filled them with my beef stew. Artists and bakers and carvers and scribes, I met them all at the inn. Sure that we'd all live forever, our nights one long dizzying spin, with work and talk in endless streams. I found the perfect fit for my dreams. Yeah, I found the perfect fit for my dreams. So Joe had returned to his hometown, Warden. He was born in 1750. So after he finished his apprenticeship, he returned to his hometown and had saved up enough money to buy both a little cottage on the edge of town and a little shop right in the middle of town, just a few blocks separated. And it was a great time for him to be a specialist in waistcoats, which he was. He was a specialist in doing all the fancy work. See, the quilting, the crewel embroidery, making the frogs that holds the front together, this little kind of heavily decorated vest. By all accounts, he was very, very good at it. And so he was able to make a living from it right off the bat. He was very successful. And it'd be kind of like being good at search about 10 years ago. Or something. Not quite like that. But anyway, waistcoats were fashionable, and he was good at it. People came into his shop. He made all kinds of apparel. He liked to talk to people, and so he did very well. He had a great friend named Billy, who was a printer, had a print shop, opened about the same time as Joe's tailor shop. And they'd get together in the evening down at the pub and solve all the world's problems, with enough stout. And then talk about books that Billy had printed for publishers down in London. Joe and Billy were good friends. They were much different kind of characters. Joe was kind of very easy to talk to around members of his own gender, but members of the opposite gender, he was kind of shy around. It felt like the longer he talked to him, the more IQ points he would shed. Whereas Billy was stimulated by this kind of situation, and he was always engaged in moving closer toward or further away from some member of the opposite sex. And I need to remind you, this was like a couple hundred years ago, back when men, in the olden days. And what Billy was concerned about was that someday some beautiful woman might talk to Joe in the wrong way and tempt him to throw away his bachelorhood prematurely. And indeed, one day, Joe was walking to work and he came around the corner, and right next door to his shop, his neighbor Edith was out on the sidewalk talking to some tall, beautiful woman, dressed like she came up from London or something. And Joe thought he would try to be like Billy for once. So as he drew up close to them, he said, pardon me, ladies, my name is Prince Joseph. And as I'm having some repairs done to my castle, I've given my servants the day off. Therefore, I am at liberty to conduct you to the bakery or anywhere you would like to be, so conducted by me. To the bakery. Or anywhere. And so this woman, she drew herself up very tall. She said, my name is Queen Isabel. I have insolent curs like you cut up and fed to pigs. So Edith could see this thing was going bad, from the very beginning. She pulled her cousin, it turned out, Isabel, aside, explained this guy was actually all right, just kind of boneheaded around some people, and introduced him properly and sent him on the way down to the bakery. On the way, Joe found out that Isabel was an artist, and she had come up to Warden from London to get some plants, some new plants, to make pictures of. She made pictures of plants out of minute pieces of cut paper on a black background. Totally realistic. Beautiful, beautiful things. And she needed some new subjects. She was there visiting her cousin for a couple of weeks. Joe wanted to hear more about it. He said, why don't you two come over to my house tonight for dinner? which they did. The next morning, Billy came by Joe's shop and said, "So, I didn't see you at the pub last night," he said, as if he didn't know where Joe had been last night, at home with these two women there. And Joe explained, "Edith's cousin Isabel from London, hey, we're going out on a picnic this afternoon, why don't you go with us?" And Billy said, all right. He went out on a picnic with him, and the next 2 weeks they spent a lot of time together. Isabel went back to London. The letters start flying. They're burning up the post office, you know. A couple weeks later, Joe made a trip to London. He told Billy he had to go down and buy some fabric. Came back, he's walking about this far off the ground. Billy could see what was happening. Anybody can see what was happening here. Joe's right down to the post office 3 times a day. And one day, finally, Billy said, he had to do something about this. He stopped by Joe's shop to give him some advice on how to live. Take your time. My friend Billy said, "You've waited this long. This is no time to lose your head." He said, "Now, Billy, you always know when you started. You always know when you're through. You always know the exact moment. The way she sips her tea starts to bother you. Well, Billy, you'll know when it's right. There'll be a certain tension in your stomach, distraction of your mind. There'll be a ringing in your ears, boy, with elongation of time. Billy, you know the symptoms. They just fill you with fear, make you feel like you're being hunted, and you run like a deer. Well, Billy, you'll know when it's right. Close your eyes. You still know it's a rose. Moonless night. You still find your way home. She's not your big house in London. She's not that book you were going to write. She's not some 4-horse carriage come to take you back to where your mama used to kiss you goodnight. Billy, I don't know where she might come from. She might just sneak up and slip in your lap. All I know is that when love hit me, I knew that I'd been slapped. And Billy, you'll know that is right. Billy, you'll know when it's right. So Billy didn't make much headway with Joe. And the thing that he neglected to mention was that the reason he was so dead set against this thing was that he'd fallen in love with Isabel himself. And he knew that as long as they didn't say "I do" to each other, there was always the chance that they might fall apart and he could step in and make his case. They seemed so happy together that There wasn't too much to go on, kind of a slender thread to hang from. But he dangled from it right through the day that Joe came to his shop and asked him to be his best man in what turned out to be the best dressed wedding in Warden for 50 years. And he sort of swung from that slender thread right through the ceremony. And he didn't think that he'd ever get used to seeing Joe and Isabel together. But they were of such good cheer. That Billy got swept up like everybody else did by the two of them. By all accounts, they were very charming. Had a lot of dinner parties. Isabel took over the gardening shed for her art shed. Had lots of plants to take pictures of. Joe had lots of work. They never had kids, so they always had time to entertain and work. The most poignant part of the show to me. Never had kids, so they had lots of time to work. I mean, they had problems in their marriage, like couples will. Apparently there was times when it seemed like no matter how carefully Joe would explain to Isabel what course of action she should take, she would go ahead on and do what she was going to do anyway. Caused real problems. And we might never have heard of them, except in the 8th year that they were together, Isabel caught a cold in the fall. She couldn't shake it. And Joe started staying home from work to take care of her. And she was sick all winter. And in the spring, an epidemic went through Warden. And when you read about it, it sounds like influenza. And a lot of people got sick. And a lot of people didn't make it. And when Isabel got sick, Joe did everything that he could think of to take care of her. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Joe, she said, I just can't get warm. Don't worry, dear. I'll cover you up. But all the sweat-soaked sheets and the feather beds and blankets in the house weren't enough. In the biggest house in the world, in the biggest house in the world, ticking clock like hammer blows, chipping away at the night, staring at an empty pillow in the pale moonlight. In the biggest house in the world, in the biggest house in the world, folding blankets, folding up clothes, folding up pictures that she made. I wish that I could fold myself and put myself away. biggest house in the world. In the biggest house in the world. So for a long time, Joe didn't want to do anything. He didn't want to drink it off. He didn't go down to the pub. He didn't want to garden. He didn't want to work. He didn't even go to work. He hadn't been to work all winter. He had savings. He didn't have to worry about it. He just stayed home a lot. And coincidentally, a young guy had moved into town and opened up a tailor shop, taking care of people's needs. And he was making these things that he called waistcoats, which were like undecorated vests. They weren't even... You couldn't even call them a waistcoat, according to Joe, but people were buying these things and wearing them. It was the new fashion, you know? So if Joe ever did go into his shop, people would come in and the kind of things that he made weren't really in fashion anymore. And he would sit around, and it was not nearly as much fun to go in and see Joe like it had used to be in former times. His friends started to worry about him after about a year. He would sit around. He was starting to run out of money. He didn't know what he was going to do. And one day, a woman came into his shop and told him what he was going to be doing next. Make me a quilt. Make me a quilt. My sister-in-law just got one from France, and I got to have one before she comes over again. Make me a quilt. Use her design. Well, not exactly the same design, but... No, exactly the same design. Make me a quilt, make it thick. But not so thick that you lie under it and sweat and then throw it off on the floor in the middle of the night. That's not what I want. Make me a quilt. I know your work. At least I saw a shirt you made one time. Didn't really do anything for me. But I think you can do it by later next week. How hard could it be to make me a quilt? Make me a quilt. Make it blue. Not too light, but not too dark either. Just like blue. Like regular, you know. Make me a quilt, make it nice. But not so nice that you leave it folded up in a drawer somewhere because you never want to use it. I don't need that. Make me a quilt, make it big. But not so big that it drags on the floor. It's just pretty good size. Like regular size. Make me a quilt. I'll have the money by later next week. I've got a hen that's laying real well. And once people see what good work you can do, you might get more orders you never can tell. So make me a quilt. Make me a quilt. Make me a quilt. I hear that you're not too busy these days, so you might as well do it. You might as well make me a quilt. Might as well. Just make me a quilt. And I have the quilt right here. Chris and Catherine.
Yes.
here. Once I find the tie. Who folded this thing? I don't have the luxury very often of asking for the lights to be aimed a certain way. So what I had to find was for the quilt to be over. How's that? Yeah. You can even see the writing in here, right? Joe Headley's first quilt. It's historical. Made by Joe Cunningham. And then down here, let's fold it up like this. Just hold the bottom half up. Right, no, just like that. Oh, you'll get professional. And then here's the title. When you're the artist, you can call it whatever you want, you know. So this one, I just pulled it in the title right here. Blue and white. I just made it up.
Just kidding you.
What I did with this, what I was interested in, unfold it back again. What I was interested in at the time was I had, for a long time, had the idea that you could make quilts freehand. You know, a lot of the old quilts from the 19th century, the classic period of American quilt making, a lot of them are astounding works of complex geometry and engineering. But a lot of them are not. A lot of them look like they used the worst template in the world. Or maybe, I thought, no template at all. They were just cutting freely with scissors and sewing things together. And what if, I thought to myself, you could do a classic pattern. Like this is Tree Everlasting, which is just bars with a sawtooth edge, you know, or vertical usually, with a sawtooth edge on it. All very symmetrical and geometric. What if you did that freehand? How would that look? What if you just started cutting out triangles and try to make them all the same size? But they wouldn't be because you're working freehand, I said to myself. And what I found out was it's kind of disappointingly easy. You don't know what you're doing, which was not the effect that I was going for, was that I didn't know what I was doing. So I had to start picking things up off the floor and, to get the real freehand look that I was doing. And a lot of crazy sewing later, taking things apart, taking the tucks and darts and things. Then I put it in the quilt frame, and I thought, you know, you can quilt freehand. You don't have to do all this marking. You can hand quilt. You taught so many quilting classes, don't you know what you're doing? So I quilted in here a spiral. It goes into a fleur-de-lis, and then into a spiral, and so on. And around the edge, I have a feather wreath with a swag, and inside the swag is a rising sun. And then a feather wreath, swag, rising sun, and so on, all the way around the edge. And it took me a long time sitting there in my studio quilting this. It was hard. It's a very Dickens to see because of this print. And trying to keep track of things without markings there, it was hard. But anyway, when you quilt an old-fashioned frame, it's all spread out in front of you, and you quilt it and you roll it as you go until you're down to the last little bit. And there's a beautiful moment when you quilt by hand in an old-fashioned frame, and that is when you take the last stitch in the last design. You take if you quilt other ways, you never really know when you're done. It sort of seems like you're done. But when you're hand quilting, you know that you're done. You take the last stitch, and then you unclamp the corners, unroll it, it's like a scroll, you unroll it, and you cut it out of the frame, and you hang it up on the wall, and you sit there, have a glass of wine, and you feel like a genius for about 15 minutes. What I did. You know, you can't even remember what it looked like. It's been so long sitting there in the fridge. And so I did that with this one. I stuck it up on the wall and sit back and looked at it and realized you can't see nothing. I'm right up on it and I can't even see it. I mean, you can see it, but you have to know what you're looking for. And that's just not the effect. It's that you want to be able to kind of show off, you know. And that was when I realized that. Then I realized maybe that the fabric that I got such a great deal on at the fabric store that I used for the backing was not the smartest thing. It's guaranteed to conceal all quilting. The look of mirth on my wife's face when I explained it to her, you know that quilt I was working on for 3 months? can't see nothing. Well, Joe liked making this quilt so much that he made another one and another one. And next thing you know, he was a quilter. He wasn't a tailor anymore, and people started calling him Joe the Quilter. And he was known as Joe the Quilter for the rest of his long life. He really enjoyed it. He made all kinds of quilts. Quilts for rich people, quilts for poor people. But he made all kinds of quilts, mostly for the people that could afford them. And you read about his quilts. Some of them are still extant. They are in museums in England, especially the Bowes Museum in Bath, which I always call Bath. But some people call it apparently Bath or something. Joe made quilts for a long time, and until, I don't know, a decade and a half or so after he started making quilts, he reached a point in his life where the fun started to leak out of it for him. Where it seemed like people would come into his shop and he would want to say to them, so what do you want, a quilt? Whoa, he's grumpy. Picking arguments down at the bar, the pub, and his friends wondering what's going on with Joe. He's been so happy working. He had lots of work. And everything's fine. What's the problem? And he didn't even know what was wrong. He just felt like he was lost in a dark wood. And he just kept thinking to himself, if only he had like a little red Miata. Or something. Just something different, just sick of everything. It's all the same out there. I'm tired of it. And one night, he was down at the pub, and somebody started talking about the Garden of Eden. Well, the Garden of Eden, he thought about that a lot, because early quilts were medallion quilts most often. Medallion, or whole cloth, or strippy quilts was the three kind of quilts that were made in England at the time. And medallion quilts were something in the middle, usually like a tree of life, or a bush of life, or something, with birds and bees and flowers all over it, and a series of borders all around. It's Garden of Eden imagery. And so he created any number of gardens of Eden, and he thought about this subject a lot. And the way Joe thought about it was such an unfair fight. He had thought about it in the terms of, like, in a boxing ring. Like you had in one corner, you have this 4 billion-year-old serpent of ultimate evil. The second most powerful entity in the universe. Diabolically, brilliantly, horribly evil. And powerful. Really, really, really powerful and horrible and evil. Really. And then in the other corner, you got these two things that were clay last week. What a fight, the suspense is killing me. Oh, and he stomped out of the bar. He was, and went down to his shop and was stomping around his shop, in the middle of the night. Garden of Eden, tell me about the garden. And all of a sudden he had an idea. He knew what he was doing. What he would do is he would make a quilt on this subject. Another Garden of Eden quilt, but he would make his own kind of Garden of Eden quilt. And it would be so brilliantly constructed that it would just change everything. People would see, it's not just a blanket, but it has all kinds of meaning built into it. It's like a work of art or something. And when they saw the quilt and they realized its brilliance, he knew that people would just fall on the ground gasping for air. And he knew that he could do it. The whole thing sprang into his mind. So we went to work on it that same night. And he worked on it for 6 months, all the while knowing nobody had ever seen anything like this before. Yeah. And while he worked, he could hear in his mind the things that people were going to say when they saw the quilt. I'll have to get used to being the talk of the town. When word of my latest quilt gets around, no more blending with the background. When everybody wants to know, how did he do that? Where can I get one? How did he do it? Sure, I've made a lot of fancy shirts, done my share of hard patchwork, but that was just beans to this rich dessert. Now everybody will want to know, how did he do that? Where can I get one? How did he do it? know I'm in the wrong business. This is when I got to the bridge about 2 months ago when I was doing this song. I realized, oh, here's how you can tell that I wrote this song 10 years ago. I said to myself, I know I'm in the wrong business if I wanted respect. I'd have to be a banker or a priest. The only time an artist gets any of that is when he paints his masterpiece. Everybody wants one, it's going to be rough. There's no way I can work fast enough. I have to raise my prices or I'll never keep up. When everybody wants to know, how did he do that? You're just about here right now. Good morning, Mr. Hedley. I heard about your new quilt. I didn't realize we had such a great artist living right down the street. Can't wait to see it. So, when he got the quilt done, in secret, didn't show it to anybody, kept it covered up with a sheet, he invited his friends over to his shop on a Sunday afternoon. Come on by my shop, Sunday afternoon. Everybody showed up, 25 or 30 people, 35. And Joe got himself ready to tell the story, you know, the Garden of Eden, and the way he saw it and everything. And he asked for a couple volunteers. Then he tried to find the topic. And he got ready to unveil the quilt, and when he was all ready, he greeted everybody. And they unveiled the quilt. Joe got ready to tell his story. And a voice came out of the back of the room. I think it was probably Billy. Said, "Hey, Joe, that's nice. You still got that red and green one you made last week?" Well, yeah. Can we see that one? Yeah. So he showed the red and green one, and somebody wanted to see the all-white one, you know, and he showed the all-white one. And somebody else wanted to see the purple one. And so he showed him the purple quilt, and then everybody was getting tired of it, so they all got up and filed. "Thanks a lot, Joe. It was a nice show. Thanks." And filed out. And nobody had fallen down gasping for air. And he realized at that time that he had been kind of overthinking this, and that he had been a little unrealistic in his expectations of what was going to happen. But the main thing was that it had gotten him over the hump. It had helped him understand that he really did like making quilts, and all he had to do was to make quilts for the rest of his life. And he did that. He made quilts for wealthy people. He made quilts for poor people. He would give them away if they couldn't. For the stable hand, for the milkmaid, he would give them to them for free. For rich people, he would charge them what you call up the wazoo. But he still liked this one. This one, when I made this version of Joe's quilt, I had been thinking for a long time of what I wanted to do. You know the hammam needlework that you'll see sometimes? The mohas that have all that little spirals and stuff. I wanted to make a little spiral. I wanted to make a spiral, but I didn't want to make a little one, you know, that you could put on an eyeglasses case or something. I wanted to be able to see it from across the room. So I had read about this, and that it's a reverse applique. That's one piece of fabric on top of another, and that you cut away the top fabric to reveal, or applique away the top fabric to reveal the bottom fabric. So I thought, well, how hard could it be? So I got this yellow piece of fabric and laid it on top of the blue and white, and just tied a knot in the end of a string and basted a spiral, trying to keep the lines, you know, about this far apart. Freehand, I'm always working freehand nowadays. There's a lot of basting, you know. And here, and then took a pair of scissors and cut between the basting lines, so that when I turned under the edges of the yellow, it would reveal the white underneath. You know, kind of knocked me into the thread and started sewing. It doesn't take too long. And then the fun part of it is you get all the way out to the edge, the end of the tail, and this is a one-sided object, it turns out. You go from here, you go all the way out, and you get out here, and you go around the tail, and you get to go all the way around. My next few quilts, you'll notice there's no applique at all. Oh, I put all kinds of quilting designs on this one here. We can flip it over, show the back. And no more heavily printed backs for me. Freehand quilting. Sometimes you do things just to show off. We can go this way just a little bit. Yeah. And what I found out about quilting things without markings is that it doesn't require any special techniques. All it really requires is just a high tolerance for variation. That's all it requires. See, like this cable, you can see it goes along and then comes along here, and something happens there in the middle. Like that. That's the kind of variation. This, I used my iron for inspiration. I wanted to quilt my iron around the edge, so I had all kinds of irons going along until I forgot how to quilt an iron. It just turned into a little triangle or something. But I love my iron. Somebody gave me this iron when it's the same age as I am, made in the early 1950s, and you know what I like about it?
It stays hot.
Oh, it's heavy and it gets hot.
Yes. And it stays hot.
And it stays hot. It doesn't shut off. When I get to be the mayor, yeah, that's going to be one of the first things. On my first day in office, I'm going to issue a recall of all modern irons. And I'm going to create a whole new body of irons that are heavy and they stay hot. Well, Joe made quilts for the rest of his long life. Sometimes he made very simple quilts. You're going to like this one. It's made out of wool, which means it's about 3 times as heavy as the last one. I hope you're all right. All that yoga. All right. Oops. Goes like this. You got to get my quilts with the right side up, or they just don't make any sense. I never went to college or anything. I've never studied art, and I don't know anything about color theory. Believe it or not. And the way I usually work is I just throw a bunch of fabric on the floor, and then I take away the parts that don't work. You know what I mean? That I don't like the way they go together. And when I got down to, this was a whole bunch of wool, and when I got down to these 2 colors here, it was like a little voice in my head that said, yeah, sew those together, sew them together. And that's the sort of thing you're supposed to listen to. So I did. I figured out, well, what's the simplest block that you could make, like a freehand style? And I thought, well, you could take a square, then cut it somewhere, and then make it out of the 2 fabrics, then make another square, cut it somewhere, and so on. And then line them all up and see what it looks like. And it turns out, this is what it looks like. And so I worked along until I ran out of the green and orange, or yellow, green, and orange, whatever it is. And it wasn't big enough to be a quilt, and so I had to add something onto it. And I tried every wool that I had in the house, in the studio, and everything didn't work. And what really didn't work was that purple. When I laid up against those things. And so the little voice in my head said, hey, sew it together, sew it together. So I added the purple to make it long enough. And then it still wasn't big enough, so I needed a border. And on early quilts, there was often a wide chintz border, brown printed chintz. And I didn't have any chintz, but I had this batik. And even though it was cotton, and this is wool, and I'd never seen a cotton border on a wool interior before. I called my friend Julie, the historian, and I said, did you ever see that cotton border on a wool interior? No, you've never seen that before. And the little voice in my head went, hey, sew it on. So I sewed it on there, even though there's no colors in here that are in there or anything. And then I sat down and quilted it with all these English quilting designs, freehand, a little bit higher. You can see these designs all. These are from Northern England, Joe Headley's stomping ground. can see the title right here, The Time to Quilt. That's what time it is in my house. And, just quilted the dickens out of it. Feathers, freehand feathers all along the edge. Oh, I had a ball.
So, is that the same way you do the back? You just kind of see what you've got left and put it together?
Yeah,
Okay.
just a scrap back.
Well, I was wondering, with the first two, you have a strip across the bottom.
Well, this is for a hanging. This is a sleeve. This strip, and the other one, it has it's a hanging sleeve, so you can put a rod through it. But yeah, I just use anything that I feel like for the back. And this is what I call it straps. When I got it done, I liked it so well, and I like things that I don't understand, and I really didn't understand it, and I liked it so well that I gave it to my wife for Christmas. And after the Christmas vacation, I was taking the kids to school with the minivan. They were in elementary school then. And at the last stop sign before the elementary school, out in front of me came the crossing guard. And that was when I realized what that little voice in my head had been telling me to do was to make a safety vest. A quilt no truck would ever hit. You can wear it in the woods. Go deer hunting in.
Purple, you've got right again. I read some of it.
Oh, yeah, it says, right here, it says, The Time to Quilt, is what it says. Oh, and then down here,
Right in the middle.
it says, Joe Cunningham, 2003. And then here it says, Joe Cunningham, the Quilter. It's a little confusing. Yeah. Oh, man. I wanted to make a bunch of quilts for this in Joe's style, but I got a little tired of making old-fashioned format quilts. And I realized that, and there were made so few kinds of quilts at that time, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And I thought, I don't know if I can do it anymore. And instead of a medallion, I thought, I know what I could do. I could make an anti-medallion. Instead of something in the middle, with a series of borders around it, I could put nothing in the middle and have all the borders crash into it. Right? An anti-medallion. This is an idea my therapist had a field day with. Nothing in the middle, and then have all the borders crash into it. So everything was all freehand, all the gold stuff around the edge, just cut up and sewed together freehand, and then these border pieces, and just cut it and sew it, freewheeling it, and which is a blast to do. It really affected a lot of my later work. And you just have to be prepared for the idea that you're going to be taking tucks and darts, and you're going to be unsewing and trimming and putting things back together, and it can wear a person out. I mean, it was a lot of fun until it got to be so that it wasn't fun anymore. And then I started thinking that I'd just been on tour in Los Angeles, and somebody had taken me to a Japanese fabric shop, and I had bought this midnight blue, indigo blue fabric from Japan that I totally loved. And I loved this fabric so much that I didn't even, I thought to myself, a piece of fabric like that, it'd be a shame to cut it up. We could just put it on there and the quilt would be done. You know what I mean? So I washed it, ironed it, and when I laid the two things on the ground, on the floor, to see how they fit together, there was a big gap down at the bottom here, which then I had to fill in. So I thought I was going to fill it in with blue, and then I thought, what the heck, fill it in with red. That's how you make art. And yeah. And I kept waiting. For several years, I waited for someone to tell me, hey, Joe, you can't do that. You can't just stop 2/3 of the way through and slap a big piece of fabric on there and call the quilt done. But apparently you can. Apparently you can. Nobody ever told me you can't do that. The backing, if we flip the sleeve over, I quilted the words in it upside down and backwards, just to show off. Let me see if we go this way a little bit. No, you still can't read them.
No, you can't.
Straw into gold, it says, from a real live Rumpelstiltskin. At the time I read this, I was reading obsessively the story of Rumpelstiltskin over and over to my kids. Did you ever read that story?
No.
Anything strike you as kind of peculiar about her? Why doesn't she have to keep the deal?
Yeah.
What kind of lesson is that for my kids? Why doesn't she keep the deal? I kept saying to myself, Mommy, make him stop. So Joe made a lot of quilts apparently. Joe Headley, and these are just a slight example. And he lived a long life. And you can still find some of his quilts. Some of them are online in museums in England, like I said. The Bowes Museum has a couple for sure. Joe made a lot of quilts. In some of the stories you read about him, he sounded like a hermit. Sometimes he would come over, they say that he was an itinerant quilt maker. He would come and set up shop in your barn and make quilts for your family. Lived there for a few months. And sometimes he was a great storyteller, entertainer of folks at the pub and at his own house and everything. He lived to be 80 years old. In his 80th year, one night he couldn't sleep. And so he went up on the hill behind his house, looked down at his town, wrote a poem. Which then I could set to music. My fingers are numb, I got a pain in my shoulders. This morning, felt like I'd been up moving boulders. I just stayed up too late, drank too much tea. Now it feels like the world's almost done with me. When I was young, I saw in black and white. I always knew exactly what was wrong and right. I knew what I knew about philosophy and art. Now why couldn't everybody else be so smart? I knew what I knew. I was all decided. So sure I was right. I burned. But no quilt that you make is one-sided. And stitch by stitch I learned. I learned. Oh, I was smug when I started out. Floating ideas on a river of stout. King George only would have listened to me. Today we'd still own the colonies. I knew about love, I'd read so much. I knew all about it when I was untouched. I knew when I found love, I'd never let it go. I'd never let it go. Yeah, I knew what I knew. I was all decided. So sure I was right. I burned. But no quilt that you make is one-sided. And stitch by stitch I learned. I learned. by letting go. I learned it doesn't matter how much you know. I learned to watch and see where it goes. And I learned to love the side that never shows. I knew what I knew. I was all decided. So sure I was right. I burned. But no quilt that you make is one-sided. And quilt by quilt, stitch by stitch, day by day I learned. I learned. Nobody knows exactly what happened on the last night of Joe's life. There was a couple strangers seen leaving his door one evening. And it turns out that they were highwaymen of some type. Nobody knows whether they had heard some of the rumors that he had made himself wealthy through quilt making. There were rumors apparently about that, that his cottage was stashed full of gold, that he had made himself wealthy through quilt making, just like you. Or his house was on the edge of town. Maybe it was just seemed like a convenient, very neatly kept little place, and the guys broke in, and Joe was there, and there was a struggle that he lost, which is kind of a tragic ending, except that nobody ever confessed to the crime, and so it became a famous case in the area. There was newspaper articles, people searching for Joe's killers for a long time. And consequently, the Ballad of Joe the Quilter got written. And his name stayed out there for a long time. And people held on to his quilts. So instead of dying anonymously, those guys apparently did history a favor. One evening, soon after supper, two men were seen leaving Joe's door. When Mrs. Poole came in the morning, she found him dead on the floor. A little house on the corner. They must have thought him a well-off man. Nothing was there for the taking. He was just rich in his heart and his hands. With work and talk in endless streams. Joe found the perfect fit for his dreams. Yeah, he found the perfect fit for his dreams. But I have some more quilts. Can we talk about them? All right. So for a long time, what I did was I made quilts based on historical themes, based on historical quilts. They were kind of inside jokes for me and about 5 quilt historians. When they saw my quilts, they'd go, you know? Like, I don't know what exactly what I was doing. But at a certain point, because of a whole bunch of different things, I realized that actually I was the only one who cared about that. And actually what I could do was anything I wanted. Like the quilt makers that I revered in the 19th century. They weren't keeping some tradition alive. They were inventing a tradition. They were doing whatever they wanted. So I thought, what would it look like if you just did anything you wanted? Not to please somebody else, but just to please yourself. If you just did whatever you had inside you and just let it come out. And it turns out it's not that much. I started using a lot of bias tape about 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years ago. I don't know. Bias tape is, you know, the stuff that's used for binding, like on a Chanel suit or something. The It's cut on the bias of the fabric, and it's sold, you know, on those little cards in the sewing shop. The old ladies used to put it around their aprons and stuff. Before quilters learned how to make their own bias. If you're going to make applique quilts and stuff, you make your own bias tape out of the fabric that you want it to be out of. You don't have to buy the commercial stuff. Well, I started using the commercial stuff because I really liked it. I like the hard line it is. And so this is just little 6-inch sticks of bias that I sewed down with black thread. I call it a winter twister. And then the quilting, this is machine quilting. I finally stopped whining about these long arm machine quilters. And I said, you don't get to whine about it if you're not going to try it yourself and come up with something better. So the quilting designs here are, it's like a stack of paper that got blown by the wind. So this is the little freehand squares all over the whole thing. Except for in here, where I didn't want to put the white quilting across the black stick. And the way I use the long arm machine that I use is owned by my friend Karen. I rent time on her machine, $15 an hour. And it's the greatest thing in the world because the long arm is here and her quilting, her sewing area is right over there. So she's there all day when I'm quilting. And in my real life, I'm a 60-year-old man. But when I'm over at Karen's, I'm more or less like a 13-year-old girl. It's her machine, you know? And so, like if the bobbin runs out, let us say, I'll be quilting along and all of a sudden the bobbin, I run out of bobbin, you know? Whoa. And I turn the, you know, I let go of the handle and turn it off. And what happened? Did you run out of bobbin? I don't know. You just quit. Brush it all out, put a fresh bobbin in there and test it out. There you go. Thanks a lot. Ooh. Did your thread break? It was just, I don't know, it just, I don't know, what happened? It's terrible. And then to have to go home, where I don't get treated like that. At all. So, I was quilting along, and I had to get down inside the sticks, and there are places, like here, where it's captured, and I couldn't get in there. I didn't want to start and stop. You know, when you're doing a long arm quilting, you have to, starting and stopping is your enemy. You don't want to have to tie off the threads and stuff. So I couldn't figure out how to get in these captured spots. And I stopped, and Karen came over, is something wrong? I said, I don't know what to do, how to get inside here without going across the things. And Karen said, oh, Joe, don't you know, that's why they invented a Sharpie. She said. That's why they invented a Sharpie. So, wherever there's a captured spot, you can see where the Sharpie was most helpful. It didn't seem like it had enough elements to it, so I put this darning stuff on there. And somebody told me earlier this year that I should change the title from Winter Twister, I should instead call it Darn It. We're going to just wait to see the back.
Wow.
Why do your quilts have horizontal fold lines?
Horizontal fold lines, diagonal fold lines.
Diagonal fold.
Diagonal fold lines, because I fold them diagonally, so it's not to get the heavy crease down the middle and both ways. You know, my quilts spend a lot of time in suitcases on the road, and so I fold them diagonally different every time. And so this is the way it came out of the suitcase just now. But when I hang it up on a pole in my studio for a little while, the fold lines fall right out. Whereas, if you fold it the same way every time, then it'll get a heavy crease in there. Okay. So I worked for a long time on long arm quilting. What I heard about 10 years ago was that there was computerized quilting machines. Are you kidding me? I mean, I've written books about quilting designs. This is my whole thing. It's the only thing that I really know anything about is antique quilting designs. How to mark them, the origin of them. Is there a problem? Quilting designs. What could you do if you had a computer running your long arm. You could quilt anything, you know? You wouldn't have to just do hand quilting designs. You could do anything. Plus, you could work in a series. Oh man, that would be the greatest. What are people doing with these computerized long arms, I asked, innocently. And I learned that what they were doing was they were doing feather wreaths and fans and cables, hand quilting designs. And they were making them look more robotically perfect, you know. You key in, I got 8 blocks, each one 9 inches wide, and then the border is 12 inches. And it will quilt each block exactly the same. Or you can alternate this design, this design. Are you kidding me? Like a machine that could do anything? It's like, all right, let's just take for an example, the universe. That's all, just the universe. And let's just say every single thing that was ever created, ever, by anybody, through all time. Out of all of those things, hand quilting designs are a very, very small slice. There's very few of them, really. And then there's the whole rest of the universe that you could use for quilting designs. Are you kidding me? So I started working on this project, and I will spare you all the gory details, but it took me 7 years until I was able to get the right combination of software and hardware done, and finally the head of a long arm company found out about it, and she emailed me and said, Joe, this sounds great. Why don't you come up to Salt Lake City and be our artist in residence at our headquarters for a week, and I'll give you our best machine and 4 technicians to make this design you've been working on for 7 years. Yeah, I didn't work on it all day for 7 years, but I don't know. I kept trying to figure out how to get this thing done. So it was a picture of a house. And what I wanted to do was a whole cloth quilt. I get so bummed out. I love whole quilts so much. And when a genre goes extinct, and if you see a whole cloth quilt nowadays, it looks like it was designed in 1850. There'll be a medallion in the middle and a bunch of feathers around the edge and crisscross. I mean, they all look the same, and they're all like from 1850. And come on, couldn't we do a modern whole cloth quilt, especially with a computerized design machine? So I finally got my quilt done. Which, as you can see, is a house with a tree in front of it. Does it show up? Does it show up? Can you see? It's one whole big picture. The challenge is what I figured out you had to do was to trick the software by making it in blocks. You can see across the top that it's 7.5-inch blocks, see? That I couldn't tell from one to the next whether I was designing a board or whether I was designing a shadow. But you can see the lines, right? 7.5-inch squares. And the whole thing is like that. You can follow like this line, see it follows down. Then you can see across here. It's 13 rows of 10 blocks each. You see what I mean? Well, yeah. Oh, I had fun with that. And you should see the backing on this one. I had so much fun with this, and it was really tough, but I finally figured out a lot of the technical stuff that I had to figure out. And the company then hired me to come down to the trade show in Houston in the fall and to do one in their booth at Houston. So I did this one.
You used your blue fabric.
I used my blue fabric that I like so much. It's denim. And this one, the head of the company was there, and I started pulling up here, and he would come around and look and see what the machine, this robotically run machine was doing. And he would look at, oh. He would say, oh. But then as it goes down, you can see, if you squint, you can see that it's actually a crowd of people. It's trying to keep us out at the top. And then there's a police barricade along the bottom. Does that show up? This is called reception of the quilter. Barricade and hold the people back. The quilter's over here. It's the reception of the quilter. The software, the people look much more realistic when I drew them. But then the software makes all kinds of decisions, which on a tree, like the previous one, you don't know what those leaf lines that I designed were supposed to look like. It did what the software translated them any way it wanted to. But what it does the craziest things to faces and that you would never think to do, you know. So you have to think of this as sort of like a collaboration between you and the software. And you have to have a high tolerance for variation. Therefore, reception of the quilter. I was thinking recently about all of my ancestors. And there's a lot of them. It turns out, you know, you go back a couple million years. A lot of ancestors. And I was thinking about how they all went through all those things that they went through to end up here, at this. And I wondered if it was worth it to them. We don't know. But I thought that I would make a quilt about my ancestors. So it's called Ancestors. And then the quilting is all picture frames. It's empty picture frames like you would have on your wall for your ancestors. If we hang them around these poor people over there, don't even see anything.
Is that bias tape?
It's all bias tape. I just cut out a couple mountains of body parts, you know, and little short pieces and longer pieces and longer, and then folded the ends under and glued them together so that I had ribs and legs and arms and stuff that I could work with. And I just started making skeletons.
Put that on after we quilt it.
No, it's on first. The quilting goes right over these guys. It turns out my concern about the white thread on the black was way overblown. You can hardly see it. Yeah. It's denim on the back, makes it very heavy.
But that's machine quilted too, right?
Pardon me?
That's machine quilted.
Machine quilted. I do both still, but I machine quilt a lot.
That's computerized.
No, it's not. This is freehand, just freehand picture frames. And because it's a twill weave, this is denim on the back. Because it's a twill, only the horizontal lines show up, and the vertical lines just disappear. So it ends up kind of looking like either boats or coffins or something.
Morse code?
Yeah, Morse code.
Did you just use your Sharpie again on that?
I didn't even use the Sharpie on that. You can look at this afterwards. I'll leave it out here. Fold it with the skeleton out if you would.
Okay.
And you can see the white thread doesn't even bother the black. It sinks down in kind of. My concern is overblown. I use a lot of fabric from the Textile Training Center in Ghana. This is the only one that I have. There's a company in Mendocino County, California, that imports it called Anansi Village, A-N-A-N-S-E, Anansi Village. They got a website, anansivillage.com, which is out of this world. And they sell this beautiful fabric. You know, African fabric, in order to use it, I mean, African fabric there's the waxy print on like batik all over it. Then they put the very loud print on top of that. And it's very difficult to have it say anything other than African fabric. You know, it's like, oh, I'm going to make my safari quilt now. And I mean, it's hard. And I have done it with difficulty a couple times to use African fabric and not have that jump out at you as the first thing. African fabric. Oh. Well, this stuff is only the wax. It doesn't have the print on top. So it's just the wax, and they make an art form out of it, and I love that. This piece that I saw at the show last year, I totally loved because it looks like a drop cloth from the wax factory floor. So that's what I use for the background. And then a Japanese friend of mine had sent me this stack of African. I made a quilt for the Japanese indigos. I made a quilt for the tsunami orphans, and to thank me, she sent me a bunch of antique indigos, which I love so much. And you know how I am about Japanese indigo. And I was trying to figure out how to get this shape that I knew the shape that I wanted, how to do that. And I started to think of piecing everything together. And then I realized, oh, you know what you could do? You could just patch it on it like you patch your jeans. Which was such a dumb, unquilty idea. Which is my specialty. There's ideas that are so dumb nobody would think of them. And so I just patched everything on. I turned the edges under and just sewed it down like I was sewing a patch down. And then when I got it done, I had to put my bias tape on there, of course. And then I made up a quilting language for it, so it's got 5 different shapes repeated over and over on it. And so I thought, oh, it's all patched like that. I know, I'll call this one Patchwork Quilt. Patchwork Quilt.
You got your neon orange again. At least it looks like that from back.
Neon orange?
Or like the one you made your wife for Christmas.
Oh, that's right. I love orange. I do love orange very, very much. It's my favorite color, actually. Yes. Orange and sort of what they call poison green are the ones that I really like. Here's a workshop we're going to do tomorrow. This is called Rock the Block. Block style. Your arms right up. This one obviously is a landscape. Come on. Rose bushes and the sticks and the greenery and everything. The sky. This is what we'll be doing tomorrow in the workshop. It's all paper pieced. Oh no, it's not. Your quilt probably won't look anything like this, I hope. Everybody's quilt will look different, but there's no, there's no thinking involved here. You don't have to think, you just do what I tell you. And each block will be completely different. And they will all be the same but different. And it'll be fun all day long. For me. Check my email. No. I'll be monitoring very closely the action all day long. So this is what we're going to be doing, something like that.
Can we see the back of that one?
Yeah. This one is it's a Marimekko print, you know. Yeah, orange. I like orange. It looks like it's pieced, but it's just printed.
Oh, this one?
It's a print. Marimekko. It's from Finland or where's Marimekko from?
Finland.
Finland, yeah. I was artist in residence at the Young Museum for the greatest month of my whole life. It was the coolest. They pay you to go to work every day. They give you this beautiful studio. They give you a bunch of assistants, and then you just get to sit there and sew all day. Or I mean, that's what I did for that beautiful month. They had to tie a rope around me and hook it to a tractor, get me out of there. And you'd sit there in this beautiful, beautiful space at the edge of Golden Gate Park with the lighting and your quilts on the walls, the videos of you and your quilts showing all day long, and the public coming through and asking very hard questions. How did you get so smart? Oh, well, I just not really. It was a blast. So I was sitting there. Somebody had sent me a package of aqua blue bias tape. And I thought, well, how could I sew that down? How could I show this off? Well, it's upside down. I don't even know my own quilt. I guess not. There's the sleeve. How could I show it off? And I just got this piece of fabric from a yard sale. It was a failure from a dye class, 50 cents. But it wasn't big enough, so I put this piece of calico on there to show off the aqua. And I started doing my favorite thing, which was to sew these strips on. the machine, zoom, 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 zoom. And I got 4 or 5 of them going along there, and then I realized that what I was making was a river, like a river through the desert, you know? And I liked that so much that I thought, oh, I know, you know what rivers do, whoop, 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 whoop. And so, and then people were gathered around, you know, and watching the artist sew. All right, zoom, zoom, zoom. I sewed it like this on it, and then like a river would go, and then I hung it up on the wall and looked at it, and it was the dumbest thing I'd ever done, because it was the only thing like that on the whole quilt, was this, and everything else was going like this, and so then I had to unsew it, which is kind of embarrassing in front of all the people, but so I unsewed it all, and sewed it back down straight like that, like a tributary or something. And then started to pick out all the little threads that had been left from the original one. And everybody that was gathered around me said, no, 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 don't take those out. That's the best part of the quilt. I thank you, I said. Best part of the quilt, right there. The leftover threads. Don't take those out. So once I figured out it was a ghost river in the desert, then I decided to quilt it with ghost salmon. All over. Salmon had been on my mind, you know, they're in trouble out in California there. And I have to point out that they're salmon because I don't draw that well in the first place, and then drawing with a sewing machine, a long arm, I'm even less reliable. And I have had people look at this and say, I love those whales. And they're not whales. They're salmon.
I knew that.
Salmon. Just love those whales. All right, sometimes I hand quilt, sometimes I machine quilt. This is one of my recent ones that I hand quilted. A friend of mine, a young guy named Luke Haynes, is blowing up in the quilt business. He has all kinds of shows, and he's got a new gallery, just moved to Los Angeles, a new studio in Los Angeles. We were at he does portraits. He'll have a quilted background, like log cabin or something, and very realistic looking people, portraits that he lays on top of this quilted background. And we were at a show together, and we were talking. He said he couldn't believe that I could just start out cutting and sewing and not knowing what the quilt was going to look like. I mean, that's my main theory, is sewing without knowing. And he couldn't believe it. You know, he said, I know what my next 30 quilts are going to look like. They're all planned out. Oh, yeah. Insanity. For me, I would just shoot myself in the head. I knew my next 30 quilts are going to look like. That's the stupidest thing. And so we were making fun of each other's way of working for a few minutes, and then we realized, oh, this is a challenge. We have to make each other's quilt, don't we? You have to make one where you don't know what's going to happen. I have to make a portrait quilt. Okay. So it was not a competition, but I won. I made a portrait of Luke. And then he made one of his shows is called In the American Context, which is back up like thank you. Has all these American icons in it, pickup truck and a screwdriver and all these things. In the American context. So this was called Luke Haynes in the American context. In his. And so that's why I had to make it red, white, and blue. So that's he has black hair actually, but. And these are buttons. These are just little white buttons. And this is just yarn that I just top stitched down with my sewing machine. I just stitched it down, which was fun. And down here is rickrack. Somebody gave me some rickrack. Said, "Oh, you like bias tape? You probably really like rickrack." I don't know. But then I quilted it by hand. I I had a great time doing it. The bottom part is, my son gave me a grocery sack full of his worn out blue jeans. He's at the School of the Arts in San Francisco, and he's in the creative writing program. And his, actually we're in the same line of work, it turns out. There's 23 women, girls in his class in the whole department, and 2 boys. And so I didn't even notice it until I got it all done, and I noticed there's all this something written here on the leftover. Some girl had written on his pants with a felt tip pen. It says, "Jules is a slut." And when I showed that to Luke, well, he wanted the quilt all the more. But he can't afford it. Are there any questions? Questions of a personal nature?
How is a Joe Headley quilt recognized? Did he sign them, or did he have a special
He
way?
didn't. They're only traditionally, and there's only a few that there's, documentation comes with them. My grandmother bought this from Joe Headley in a letter signed 1823 kind of thing. He was born in 1750, died in 1830. And so there's just a few quilts that are said to be by Hedley. Supposedly there's a dealer in London that has one, but I've not been there to see it. But in the Bowes Museum they have 2. And they are very nice quilts. He was particularly adept at all kinds of fancy work, at white work and at the medallions. I mean, they're really, really nice quilts. But he didn't sign them, so we don't know. So I was just trying to make like poems about the quilts made at that time.
You sign yours?
I do. I sign all of mine in the quilting. I often will put the title in at the bottom of the quilt. Here. See here? Joe Cunningham. And then the date. I hate to put labels on quilts. I hate it because labels can come off. Joe Cunningham 2010. It says right there. So my name and the date I put on there. The first time I made a quilt like that, it was just black stripes on a white background. It had my name there. And I was just learning how to machine quilt, so I started doing this signature that size like that. And in my house, the only quilt that I have hanging up is right behind the dining room table, on the wall in my dining room. And so the table is here. And I must say, my quilts, they're about 6 feet square, right? And so I change the quilt periodically. I get a new one done, I hang it up on the wall. There's 4 of us in my family. My wife sitting over there, me sitting here with my back to the quilt, Dorian and Jules. Very often, I'll change the quilt, and it'll be about 3 weeks before anybody notices. 6 feet square. The last one was all pink, Oh, great. And this, this one is all blue. Or it's all a bunch of crazy colors. Yeah. About 3 weeks. Oh, did you change the quilt, Dad? So anyway, I had one just like this. It was sitting just like this on the white part of the bottom. When I finally pointed out, did anybody notice it's a new quilt 4 feet from you? And Dorian looked at it, and he looked at the bottom. He said, hey, look, Dad, somebody put your name in it. You guys have been so patient. I really appreciate it.